In 1798, a 70-year-old man sat down to tell a story that would shatter everything people thought they knew about what was possible. His name was Venture Smith. He'd been born Brotier Furo, the son of an African prince. At 6 years old, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery. For the next 30 years, he endured brutal treatment under 3 different masters who worked him like an animal and stole most of what he earned. But here's what makes his story absolutely incredible. By the time he died in 1805, this man, who'd been bought for 4 gallons of rum, owned over 100 acres of land, 3 houses, 20 boats, and had systematically purchased freedom for himself and his entire family. He left behind one of the first slave narratives ever published in America, documenting every step of his impossible journey. But here's the question that haunted historians for centuries. How did a man who started with literally nothing, whose masters took almost everything he earned, who faced a system designed to keep him enslaved forever, manage to accumulate enough wealth to not only buy his own freedom for a price equal to 4,000 acres of land, but then build an empire? That would make him one of the most successful property owners in Connecticut. Stay until the end, because the answer reveals a strategy so brilliant, so methodical, that it'll change how you think about overcoming impossible obstacles in your own life. Let's go back to the beginning, to 1729, in a place called Dukandara, somewhere in West Africa, probably in what's now Guinea or Ghana. Brotier Furo wasn't born into poverty or hardship, he was born into royalty. His father, Songmum Furo, was a prince, possibly even a king, of the Dukandara tribe. He had 3 wives, which tells you something about his status and power. Brotier was the eldest son. In his culture, that meant something. It meant he was being groomed for leadership. It meant he had prospects, a future, a destiny that stretched out before him like a road already paved. Imagine being that child. You wake up every morning knowing who you are. You're the son of a prince. You have protection, status, identity. The world makes sense. Your place in it is secure. And then, in one day, all of that gets ripped away. Brotier was 6.5 years old when enemy warriors attacked. During tribal conflicts that we can barely piece together from historical records, he was captured, not killed. Captured, because even at 6 years old, he had value as property. For 2 years, he was held prisoner. Think about that. From age 6 to age 8, this child who'd been a prince was locked up, waiting to find out what would happen to him. What happened was the slave trade. Around 1735 or 1736, Brotier was sold to slave traders. He was marched to the coast, where a ship called the Charming Susanna waited. The captain was a man named Collingwood. The ship had sailed from Newport, Rhode Island, and it was there to collect human cargo. According to Venture Smith's own account, which he'd dictate decades later, 260 enslaved people were purchased and loaded onto that ship. 260 human beings packed into a vessel designed to maximize profit, not preserve life. The Middle Passage, that's what historians call the voyage across the Atlantic. But that sanitized term doesn't capture what it actually was. It was hell on water. The conditions were so brutal that 1/4 of the people on that ship died during the crossing. 60 human beings who started the journey and didn't make it to the other side. Disease, starvation, despair. The ship stopped in Barbados first, part of the triangular trade route that treated human beings like any other commodity. And Brotier? He survived. At 10 or 11 years old, he survived what killed 60 others. When the ship finally reached Rhode Island, a man named Robinson Mumford, who worked as the ship's steward, looked at this child and saw an investment opportunity. He purchased Brotier for 4 gallons of rum and a piece of cloth. That's what a prince's son was worth in this system. 4 gallons of rum. Mumford gave him a new name, Venture. It wasn't a name chosen with any care or meaning. It was just what Mumford decided to call his new property. And just like that, Brotier Furo, son of Prince Songmum Furo, ceased to exist in any official capacity. He was now Venture enslaved boy, owned by the Mumford family. They took him to Fisher's Island, a piece of land sitting between Connecticut, New York, and Rhode Island. The Mumfords had property there, and that's where Venture would spend his childhood and early adult years. Not playing, not learning, not growing into the leader he might have become. Working. Always working. Always working. Here's what you need to understand about slavery in colonial New England. It wasn't the massive plantation system of the Deep South. It was more intimate, more personal, and in some ways that made it even more insidious. You weren't one of hundreds of enslaved people. You were one of a handful, living in close quarters with the family that owned you, seeing their humanity every day while they refused to see yours. In 1741, when Venture was about 12 years old, Robinson Mumford died at sea. Ownership of Venture transferred to Robinson's father, Captain George Mumford. New master, same chains. And this is where we start to see something remarkable about Venture Smith. He was growing. Not just physically, though that was happening too. He was growing in understanding. He was watching, learning, figuring out how this system worked. Because here's the thing about Venture Smith that made him different. He was big. Not just tall, not just strong. He was extraordinary. By the time he was fully grown, he stood over 6 feet 1.5 inches tall. In the 1700s, that was giant. He weighed somewhere between 230 and 300 pounds, depending on which account you read. His waist diameter was reportedly 6 feet around. He could swing a 9-pound axe all day long, felling trees that other men couldn't touch. People who saw him work compared him to Paul Bunyan, a real-life legend. His strength wasn't just impressive, it was economically valuable. And Venture Smith understood something that most people in his position didn't have the luxury to understand. His strength gave him leverage. But we're getting ahead of the story, because before Venture could use his strength to buy his freedom, he had to endure decades of brutality that would have broken most people. The historical records don't give us every detail of those 30 years of enslavement, but we know he was sold multiple times. He worked under 3 different masters. Each time he was sold, it was a reminder that he wasn't a person, he was property. He could be transferred, traded, disposed of at will. The instability alone would drive most people to despair. You can't build anything when you don't know if you'll be ripped away from it tomorrow. And the work. It was backbreaking. Fishing, farming, cutting wood, whatever needed doing, Venture did it all. His masters worked him hard because they could, because his strength meant he could do the work of 2 or 3 men, and they paid him nothing. Well, that's not quite true. Sometimes they'd let him hire himself out to other people. He could work extra, beyond what his master required, and keep some of the money. Some of the money. Here's where the mathematics of slavery become crystal clear. At one point, Venture was working at Fisher's Island. He managed to earn £20 through his labor. £20, that's real money. That's the result of grueling, exhausting work, hours and hours of his life converted into currency. His master took £13 and 6 shillings as what they called privilege fees. Privilege. The privilege of being allowed to keep a fraction of the money you earned with your own body. Venture was left with £6 and 14 shillings, not even a third of what he'd earned. Do the math. If Venture kept roughly 1/3 of what he earned, that means to accumulate any significant amount of money, he'd have to work 3 times as hard as a free person would. And he was already working harder than most free people ever would. But here's what's remarkable. He didn't give up. He didn't say it was impossible. He looked at those numbers and he made a plan. Around 1750, Venture married a woman named Meg, sometimes called Margay in the records. She was also enslaved, owned by the Mumford family. They built a life together in the only way enslaved people could, knowing that at any moment they could be separated. They had children. Sons named Solomon and Cuff, a daughter named Hannah. They created a family in the midst of a system designed to destroy families. And then, in the early 1760s, something changed. Venture was sold again, this time to a man named Colonel Oliver Smith. And Colonel Smith, according to the historical accounts, was different. He was described as kindly. Now, we have to be careful with that word. He still owned human beings. But he did something that other masters didn't. He allowed Venture to hire himself out and keep enough of his earnings to actually accumulate money. This was Venture's chance, and he knew it. For 5 years, Venture Smith worked like a man possessed. He took every job he could find. He fished, he farmed, he cut timber, he did whatever paid. And this time, he was keeping enough of his earnings to actually save. Every penny went into a fund with one purpose: freedom. Think about what that took. 5 years of the hardest work imaginable. 5 years of denying himself anything beyond bare survival. 5 years of hope deferred, of working toward a goal that must have seemed impossibly far away, because the price of freedom wasn't cheap. In 1765, at the age of 36, Venture Smith had finally saved enough. He went to Colonel Oliver Smith with an offer: £71 and 2 shillings. That's what Venture paid for himself, £71 and 2 shillings. To put that in perspective, that amount of money could have bought 4,000 acres of land. 4,000 acres. Venture Smith paid the equivalent of a massive estate just to own himself. On that day in 1765, something extraordinary happened. Brotier Furrow, who'd been kidnapped at 6 years old, who'd survived the Middle Passage, who'd been bought for 4 gallons of rum, who'd been enslaved for 30 years, became Venture Smith, free man. But his work wasn't done, not even close, because Venture Smith understood something profound. Freedom wasn't just about him. His wife was still enslaved. His children were still enslaved. What good was his freedom if his family remained in chains? So he made another plan, a systematic, methodical plan to buy his family's freedom, one person at a time. First, he had to establish himself economically. In 1765, Connecticut had what they called black codes. These were laws specifically designed to restrict what free black people could do, where they could work, what they could own, how they could move around. The system didn't want free black people to succeed. Success would prove that the justifications for slavery were lies. Venture didn't care what the system wanted. He went to work. He used his strength and his skills to take on the hardest, most physically demanding jobs, jobs that paid well because they required extraordinary capability. He fished the waters off Connecticut. He cut timber in the forests. He farmed. He traded. He did whatever it took. And 4 years after buying his own freedom, in 1769, Venture had saved enough to buy his 2 sons, Solomon and Cuff. He purchased their freedom. Imagine that moment. Imagine being able to look at your children and tell them, "You're free. You'll never be sold. You'll never be separated from me. You're free." But his wife was still enslaved. Meg was still owned by a man named Thomas Stanton, and the price for her freedom was steep. It took Venture another 7 years. 7 years of relentless work. 7 years of being separated from his wife, seeing her when he could, but knowing she still belonged to someone else. Around 1776, 11 years after he'd bought his own freedom, Venture finally had enough money to purchase Meg. She was pregnant at the time. The historical records tell us that. She was carrying another child, and Venture brought her home. 11 years. Think about that. 11 years of separation, 11 years of working, saving, hoping, 11 years of a family divided by economics and law. And through it all, Venture never stopped, never gave up, never accepted that this was just how things had to be. Now, here's where the story takes another turn. Because Venture Smith didn't just want to be free. He didn't just want his family to be free. He wanted to build something. He wanted to prove that a man who'd been enslaved, who'd been treated as property, who'd been told his entire life that he was less than human, could achieve the same success as any free man. More than that, actually. In 1775, Venture purchased his first piece of land, 10 acres at Haddam Neck, Connecticut. It was his, not his master's, his. He built a homestead there, a place where his family could live together, work together, build a future together. And then he kept going. If this story of systematic liberation and wealth building against impossible odds inspires you, hit that like button to help others discover what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations. Venture expanded into fishing in a serious way. He bought boats, not just one or two. According to the records, he eventually owned 20 boats. 20. He ran a fishing operation that employed other people. He sold his catch at market. He made money. He bought more land. Piece by piece, purchase by purchase, he expanded his holdings at Haddam Neck and along Salmon River Cove. He bought from a man named Bingham. He bought from others. Every transaction was documented, legal, official. By 1798, Venture Smith owned more than 100 acres. Some sources say 134 acres. Either way, it was a substantial estate. He built 3 houses on his property. 3 houses. Not shacks, not temporary shelters. Houses. Permanent structures that declared, "I'm here. I'm staying. This is mine." He ran a timbering operation. Remember that 9-pound axe? He was still swinging it, still felling trees, still doing the work that had made him legendary. But now he was doing it for himself. The profits went into his pocket, not his master's. He traded goods. He bought and sold land as an investment. He diversified his income streams in a way that would impress modern business consultants. He understood that wealth came from multiple sources, from not putting all your eggs in one basket. And he did all of this while facing constant obstacles. The black codes didn't go away just because he was successful. Society didn't suddenly embrace him. He faced betrayal. At one point, an Irishman he'd been traveling with tried to steal everything Venture and his companions had brought with them. People saw his success and wanted to take it. But Venture had spent 30 years learning how to survive in a system designed to destroy him. He knew how to protect what he'd built. He knew how to navigate threats. He knew how to persist. By the late 1790s, Venture Smith was in his late 60s. He'd been free for over 30 years. He'd built an empire. But he knew something important. His story mattered, not just for him, for everyone who would come after him. In 1798, Venture approached a man named Elisha Niles. Niles was an anti-slavery activist, someone who believed that slavery was wrong and needed to be abolished. Venture told Niles that he wanted to dictate his life story. He wanted it written down, published, preserved. And so, at 70 years old, bent with age and nearly blind, Venture Smith sat down and told his story. Every detail he could remember. From his childhood in Dukandara, to his capture to the Middle Passage, to 30 years of slavery, to his freedom, to his success. All of it. The result was published as A Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Venture, a native of Africa, but resident above 60 years in the United States of America, related by himself. It was one of the first slave narratives ever published in America, and it was revolutionary. Because Venture's narrative did something that most slave narratives didn't do. It showed the influence of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. It was structured as a success story, not just a story of suffering, though the suffering was there, but a story of triumph, of a man who refused to be defined by what had been done to him. Elisha Niles, in his preface, positioned the narrative as an abolitionist text. He wrote that it exhibited a pattern of honesty, prudence, and industry to people of his own color. Now we can critique that language today. We can see the paternalism in it. But at the time, in 1798, publishing a black man's story of success was a radical act. It was an argument against slavery. It was proof that the justifications for slavery were lies. The narrative opened with a simple, powerful line. I was born at Dukandara, not I was born a slave, not I was born into misery. I was born at Dukandara, a place, an identity, a beginning that had nothing to do with slavery. And then Venture told his story in his own words. The kidnapping, the Middle Passage, the years of enslavement, the systematic accumulation of money, the purchase of freedom, the building of wealth, all of it in first person with the authority of someone who lived it. The narrative circulated. It was read by abolitionists. It was used as evidence in arguments against slavery. It was part of the great anti-slavery movement that was gaining momentum in England and America. Did it end slavery? No. Slavery would continue for another 60+ years in America. But it was part of the foundation. It was one more piece of evidence that enslaved people were fully human, fully capable, fully deserving of freedom. Venture Smith died in 1805 at the age of 77. He was buried in the graveyard of the First Congregational Church in East Haddam, Connecticut. His wife Meg was buried beside him. Other family members joined them in that plot over the years. His gravestone reads, "Sacred to the memory of Venture Smith, an African, the son of a king. He was kidnapped and sold as a slave, but by his industry he acquired." The inscription captures everything: the African origin, the royal birth, the kidnapping, the slavery and the industry, the work, the refusal to give up, the systematic, methodical building of a life and a legacy. Today, that burial site is part of the Connecticut Freedom Trail. People visit it. They read the inscription. They learn the story. Because Venture Smith's story didn't end with his death, it continued. Now, let's talk about what made Venture Smith's achievement so extraordinary. Because it's not enough to just say he was successful. We need to understand the context. We need to compare his success to what was normal for free black people in Connecticut in the 1700s. The answer is, there wasn't much comparison. Free black people in colonial Connecticut faced massive restrictions. The black codes limited where they could work, what they could own, how they could move. Most free black people lived in poverty or near poverty. They worked as laborers, as servants, in positions with little opportunity for advancement. Venture Smith didn't just escape poverty. He became one of the most successful property owners in his region, regardless of race. Over 100 acres, 3 houses, 20 boats, multiple business enterprises. That wasn't just unusual for a black man. That was unusual for anyone. And he did it starting from literally nothing, actually less than nothing. He started as property. He had to buy himself before he could even begin to accumulate wealth, and then he had to operate in a system designed to prevent exactly what he achieved. How did he do it? Remember that question from the beginning? How did a man who started with nothing, whose masters took most of what he earned, who faced a system designed to keep him down forever, manage to build an empire? Here's the answer. And it's not simple. It's not one thing. It's a combination of factors that came together in a way that was almost miraculous. First, his physical strength. This can't be overstated. Venture Smith's extraordinary physical capabilities gave him economic value that most enslaved people didn't have. He could do work that other people couldn't do. He could do it faster and better. That meant people were willing to pay more for his labor. When he was allowed to hire himself out, he could command higher wages because he could deliver more value. But strength alone wasn't enough. Plenty of strong people stayed enslaved their entire lives. Venture had something else. He had strategic thinking. He understood the system. He understood that he needed to accumulate money. He understood that he needed to be patient. He understood that he needed to work within the system, even as he was working to escape it. When he was at Fisher's Island and his master took £13 and 6 shillings out of his £20, Venture didn't rebel. He didn't run away. He didn't give up. He took his £6 and 14 shillings and he kept working. Because he understood that even that small amount was progress. Even that small amount was moving him toward his goal. Second, he got lucky with Colonel Oliver Smith, and we have to acknowledge the role of luck here. Smith was described as kindly. He allowed Venture to hire himself out and keep enough of his earnings to actually save. Not all masters would have done that. Many masters would have taken everything. If Venture had been owned by someone else, someone less willing to allow that arrangement, his story might have ended very differently. But here's the thing about luck. Venture was ready for it. When the opportunity came, he seized it. He didn't waste it. He worked for 5 years with single-minded focus. He saved every penny. He denied himself everything beyond survival. He was ready to take advantage of the opportunity when it presented itself. Third, he had a clear goal. He wasn't just working to work. He wasn't just trying to make life a little easier. He had a specific target, £71 and 2 shillings. He knew exactly what he needed. And once he achieved that goal, he set another one. Buy his sons. Buy his wife. And then another. Buy land. And then another. Build wealth. That clarity of purpose is powerful. It's what kept him going when the work was exhausting. It's what kept him going when he faced betrayal. It's what kept him going when society told him he couldn't do it. Fourth, he documented his journey. By dictating his narrative in 1798, Venture ensured that his story would survive. He ensured that future generations would know what he'd accomplished. He ensured that his life would mean something beyond just his own experience. And that narrative became part of the abolitionist movement. It became evidence, it became inspiration, it became proof that the system was wrong. Fifth, and this is crucial, he never accepted the identity that slavery tried to impose on him. He was born Broccia Furro, son of Prince Salmon Furro. He was kidnapped and renamed Venture. But he never forgot who he was. He never internalized the lie that he was less than human. He never accepted that his circumstances defined his potential. That internal resistance, that refusal to accept the identity of slave as his true self, that's what made everything else possible. Because if you accept that you're property, if you internalize that you're less than human, then you can't imagine freedom, you can't imagine success. You can't imagine building an empire. Venture imagined it, and then he did it. Now, let's talk about the family aspect of this story, because it's not just about Venture's individual achievement, it's about what he did with that achievement. He could have bought his freedom and walked away. He could have started building wealth for himself and left his family behind. Some people did that. Some people had to do that. The system made it almost impossible to do anything else. But Venture didn't. He made a deliberate choice. He would reunite his family. He would buy their freedom. All of them. That meant 11 years of separation from his wife. 11 years of knowing she was still enslaved while he was free. 11 years of working, saving, hoping. Can you imagine the emotional toll of that? Can you imagine the guilt of being free while your wife remains in chains? Can you imagine the fear that something might happen to her before you could buy her freedom? But Venture persisted. And in 1776 he brought Meg home. She was pregnant. They were reunited. The family was whole. And then they built something together. The homestead at Haddam Neck wasn't just Venture's, it was theirs, the family's. A place where they could live together, work together, build a future together. The 3 houses he built, those were for family. The land he accumulated, that was for family. The businesses he ran, those were to support family. Everything Venture did after buying his freedom was oriented toward creating security and opportunity for his family. And that's what makes his story so powerful. It's not just about individual achievement. It's about using that achievement to lift others. It's about refusing to be free alone. It's about understanding that true freedom means freedom for everyone you love. When Venture died in 1805, he left behind a substantial estate. The exact value isn't documented in the historical records we have, but we know he owned over 100 acres, 3 houses, 20 boats, and multiple business enterprises. That's real wealth. That's generational wealth. That's the kind of wealth that changes a family's trajectory for generations. His children inherited that wealth. They inherited the land. They inherited the businesses. They inherited the example. They inherited the proof that it was possible. And beyond his immediate family, Venture's legacy extended to everyone who read his narrative, everyone who heard his story, everyone who learned that a man who'd been enslaved for 30 years could become one of the most successful property owners in Connecticut. That legacy is still alive today. The Connecticut Freedom Trail includes his burial site. Historians study his narrative, educators teach his story, because Venture Smith represents something that transcends his individual life. He represents the indomitable human spirit. He represents the power of strategic thinking and relentless work. He represents the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. Let's talk about the broader historical context for a moment. Because Venture Smith's story didn't happen in a vacuum, it happened during a specific time in American history, the late 1700s and early 1800s. This was the period of the American Revolution, the period when the founding fathers were writing about liberty and freedom and the rights of man. And they were doing it while owning slaves. The contradiction was stark. The hypocrisy was obvious, and people like Venture Smith made it impossible to ignore. His narrative was published in 1798. That's just 22 years after the Declaration of Independence, just 9 years after the Constitution was ratified. The country was still figuring out what it meant to be America. And here was Venture Smith saying, "I was born free in Africa. I was kidnapped and enslaved. I bought my freedom. I built wealth. I'm as American as anyone. What are you going to do about it?" The abolitionist movement was gaining strength during this period. In England, there was what Venture's narrative called a mighty struggle of 18 years against slavery. In America, some states were beginning to abolish slavery. Vermont had done it in 1777, Pennsylvania in 1780. Cole, Massachusetts in 1783. Connecticut itself would pass a gradual emancipation law in 1784, though it wouldn't fully abolish slavery until 1848. But the overall success in reducing slavery was limited. The system was too profitable. The economic interests were too powerful. The racial justifications were too deeply embedded in the culture. That's what makes Venture Smith's achievement so remarkable. He succeeded in a system designed to prevent his success. He built wealth in an economy that wanted to extract his labor without compensation. He created a legacy in a society that wanted to deny his humanity. And he did it without violence, without rebellion, without breaking the law. He worked within the system, even as he was proving the system was wrong. He bought his freedom legally. He bought his family's freedom legally. He bought his land legally. He ran his businesses legally. He couldn't be dismissed as a criminal or a rebel. He was a businessman, a property owner, a success story. That made him dangerous to the pro-slavery argument, because the pro-slavery argument depended on the idea that black people were inferior, that they couldn't succeed on their own, that they needed to be enslaved for their own good. Now, we need to talk about something that's often left out of inspirational stories like this: the cost, the sacrifice, the things Venture had to give up to achieve what he achieved. 30 years of enslavement. 30 years of his life spent working for other people's benefit, 30 years of being treated as property, 30 years of being sold, transferred, used. You can't get those years back. You can't undo that trauma. You can't erase that experience. 11 years of separation from his wife after he gained freedom. 11 years of working toward a goal that must have seemed impossibly far away at times. 11 years of deferred reunion. 11 years of incomplete freedom. The physical toll of the work. Swinging a 9-pound axe all day. Fishing in all weather. Farming, cutting timber, building. The work that made him legendary also wore his body down. By the time he was 70, he was bent with age and nearly blind. The work had taken its toll. The betrayals, the Irishman who tried to steal from him, the masters who took most of what he earned, the society that restricted what he could do even after he was free, the constant obstacles, the constant resistance, the constant message that he didn't belong, that he shouldn't succeed, that he should accept his place. All of that was the cost, and we can't ignore it. We can't pretend that Venture's success came easy or that it was just a matter of working hard and thinking smart. It came at an enormous cost, a cost that no one should have to pay. But here's what's also true. Venture paid that cost and still won. He endured all of that and still achieved his goals. He faced all of those obstacles and still built an empire. He experienced all of that trauma and still created a legacy. That's not to say the cost was worth it. That's not to say the system was okay, because some people managed to succeed despite it. The system was evil. The cost was too high. No one should have to endure what Venture endured. But within that evil system, Venture found a way, and his way became a model. It became proof. It became hope. Let's talk about the physical strength aspect one more time, because it's so central to understanding how Venture succeeded. In a system where enslaved people had almost no leverage, physical strength was one of the few forms of power available. If you could do work that other people couldn't do, you had value. And if you had value, you had at least some bargaining power. Venture Smith understood this. He leveraged his strength strategically. He didn't just work hard, he worked in ways that maximized his economic value. He took on the jobs that paid the most because they required the most physical capability. He made himself indispensable. But here's what's important. Strength alone wasn't enough. There were plenty of strong enslaved people who never gained their freedom. Venture combined his strength with intelligence, with strategic thinking, with patience, with discipline, with a clear vision of what he was working toward. The strength got him in the door. The intelligence and strategy got him through it. And after he gained his freedom, he continued to use his strength. He didn't retire. He didn't take it easy. He kept working, kept building, kept expanding. Because he understood that freedom wasn't just about not being enslaved, it was about building security. It was about creating opportunity. It was about establishing a foundation that couldn't be taken away. The timbering operation, the fishing business, the farming, all of that required physical labor, hard, demanding, exhausting physical labor. And Venture did it, into his 60s, into his 70s, until his body finally gave out. That's dedication, that's commitment, that's refusing to stop until you've achieved everything you set out to achieve. Now, let's come back to that question one more time. The question that's been hanging over this entire story. How did Venture Smith do it? How did he go from being property worth 4 gallons of rum to owning over 100 acres and 3 houses and 20 boats? The answer, as we've seen, is complex. It's his physical strength, it's his strategic thinking, it's his patience and discipline, it's his clear goals, it's his refusal to accept the identity slavery tried to impose on him, it's his luck in being owned by Colonel Oliver Smith at the right time. It's his willingness to work harder than anyone else, it's his commitment to his family, it's his documentation of his journey, it's all of these things working together. But there's one more element we haven't fully explored, and it might be the most important one. Venture Smith believed it was possible. Think about that. He was 6 years old when he was kidnapped. He spent his entire childhood and early adult life enslaved. He was surrounded by a system that told him every single day that he was property, that he was less than human, that he had no future beyond serving his masters. And somehow, despite all of that, he believed that freedom was possible. He believed that he could buy himself. He believed that he could reunite his family. He believed that he could build wealth. He believed that he could succeed. Where did that belief come from? Maybe it came from his early childhood, from those 6 years when he was Brotier Furo, son of Prince Song Furo. Maybe he remembered what it felt like to be free, to have status, to have a future. And maybe that memory sustained him through 30 years of slavery. Or maybe it came from something deeper, some internal conviction that he was more than what the system said he was, some refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose on him, some spark of defiance that never went out, no matter how hard they tried to extinguish it. Whatever the source, that belief was the foundation of everything else. Because if you don't believe it's possible, you don't try. If you don't believe you can buy your freedom, you don't save money. If you don't believe you can reunite your family, you don't work for 11 years toward that goal. If you don't believe you can build wealth, you don't buy land and boats and start businesses. Belief comes first. Everything else follows. And that's the lesson that transcends Venture Smith's specific historical circumstances. That's the lesson that applies to anyone facing obstacles that seem insurmountable. That's the lesson that makes his story relevant today, more than 200 years after his death. You have to believe it's possible, even when everything around you says it's not, even when the system is designed to prevent your success, even when you've been told your entire life that you can't do it. You have to believe. And then you have to work. You have to be strategic. You have to be patient. You have to be disciplined. You have to have clear goals. You have to be willing to pay the cost. You have to refuse to give up. That's what Venture Smith did, and that's what made him extraordinary. Let's talk about his legacy one more time. Because it's not just about what he achieved in his lifetime. It's about what his achievement meant for others. His narrative was published in 1798. It circulated among abolitionists. It was read by people who were fighting against slavery. It was used as evidence in arguments about the humanity and capability of black people. It was part of the foundation of the movement that would eventually end slavery in America. But beyond that, his story became an inspiration. It became proof that transformation was possible. It became a model for how to overcome impossible obstacles. It became hope for people who were facing their own struggles. And that legacy continues today. When people visit his grave on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, they're not just paying respects to a man who died more than 200 years ago. They're connecting with a story that still resonates. They're learning lessons that still apply. They're finding inspiration that still matters. Because here's the thing. The specific circumstances of Venture Smith's life were unique to his time and place, but the principles he embodied are universal: the refusal to accept limitations, the strategic thinking, the patience and discipline, the commitment to family, the willingness to work harder than anyone else, the belief that transformation is possible. Those principles apply to anyone, anywhere, facing any obstacle. That's why his story matters. That's why we're still talking about him. That's why his legacy endures. Venture Smith died in 1805, but in a very real sense, he's still alive. He's alive in his narrative. He's alive in the land he purchased. He's alive in the example he set. He's alive in every person who hears his story and thinks, if he could do that, maybe I can overcome my obstacles too. That's immortality. That's legacy. That's what it means to transform not just your own life, but the lives of countless others who come after you. So here's what we can take away from Venture Smith's incredible journey. Here's what his transformation from African prince to enslaved property to free man to prosperous landowner teaches us. First, your starting point doesn't determine your ending point. Venture started as property worth 4 gallons of rum. He ended as a man who owned over 100 acres and left a substantial estate. The gap between those 2 points is almost incomprehensible, but he crossed it. Your circumstances, right now, no matter how difficult, don't have to define where you end up. Second, transformation requires strategic thinking, not just hard work. Venture worked hard, yes, but he also worked smart. He understood the system, he identified opportunities, he made plans, he executed those plans with discipline. Hard work without strategy is just exhaustion. Strategy without hard work is just dreaming. You need both. Third, the obstacles you face might actually be the source of your greatest strength. Venture's physical strength, which developed partly because of the brutal labor he was forced to do, became his primary economic asset. The thing that was meant to break him became the thing that freed him. What's trying to break you right now might actually be developing the capabilities you'll need to succeed. Fourth, freedom isn't just personal, it's communal. Venture didn't just buy his own freedom and walk away. He systematically bought his family's freedom. He built wealth that would benefit his descendants. He documented his story so others could learn from it. True success means lifting others, not just yourself. And fifth, belief is the foundation of everything. Venture believed, against all evidence, that he could be free, that he could reunite his family, that he could build wealth. That belief sustained him through 30 years of slavery and 40 years of building. Without that belief, none of the rest would have been possible. Remember that question from the beginning. How did a man who started with nothing build an empire? Now you know the answer. He believed it was possible. He worked strategically. He leveraged his strengths. He persisted through obstacles. He refused to accept limitations. He committed to his family. He documented his journey. And he never, ever gave up. That's the answer. And it's an answer that applies to your life too. So here's my question for you. What limitations in your own life have you accepted as permanent? What obstacles seem insurmountable? What transformation seems impossible? Because Venture Smith's story tells us that impossible is just a word. It's not a fact. It's not a reality. It's just a word that people use when they can't imagine a different future. Venture Smith imagined a different future. And then he built it, one day at a time, 1 pound at a time, one purchase at a time, one decision at a time. You can do the same, not in the same way, not facing the same obstacles, but using the same principles, the same belief, the same strategic thinking, the same persistence, the same refusal to accept limitations. What's your 71 pounds and 2 shillings? What's the price of your freedom? What's the goal that seems impossible but that you're going to pursue anyway? Think about it, write it down, make a plan, and then start working toward it. Because if Venture Smith could go from being property to being a prosperous landowner, if he could survive the Middle Passage and 30 years of slavery and still build an empire, if he could reunite his family and create a legacy that endures more than 200 years after his death, then you can overcome whatever obstacles you're facing. You can transform your life. You can achieve your goals. You can build your legacy. You just have to believe it's possible, and then do the work. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Venture Smith's story resonates most with you? What obstacles are you committed to overcoming? Let's build a community of people who refuse to accept limitations, who believe in transformation, who are willing to do the work. Because that's what Venture Smith would want, not just for his story to be remembered, but for his example to inspire action, for his transformation to spark transformations in others. For his legacy to continue, not just in history books, but in the lives of people who hear his story and decide to write their own. That's the real legacy. That's the real transformation. That's what makes a life like Venture Smith's truly immortal.